Revising Reality. I'm your host, Tim Kaiser, and joining me today in the studio is, well, not in the studio, but in his own studio, is Steve Gilmore. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Yeah, welcome.
Last week we were trying to get into anyway, different extraterrestrial influences on the DNA lineage of people from Earth.
That's right.
So, where we left off, you had talked a little bit about we were going to get into, like the bigger like the mitochondrial DNA.
Well, I think we're two things. We can maybe just recap a little bit. So we drew the conclusions, or I drew the conclusions, that there are multiple races of humanity. There are marked, distinct races, but the races are fairly close together because of the inflexibility of our catalogue, our gene catalogue, which is very, very large. And we discussed this actually last time, that I am of the opinion that our gene catalogue is been used as, or aspects of it have just been taken out to create everything on the surface, all surface life. And that's why bananas, according to geneticists, are 50% human.
Which is a really interesting, weird thing to think about.
It is. It's not weird if you know the truth.
Well, okay. Well, here's the thing. Okay, so is eating a banana then 50% cannibalism?
Well, potentially, but I mean, cannibalism is a concept. It's a moral concept. And even I've talked about the great deception was Moses and his parable and his commandments, which were basically instructions, not God's instructions, they were his, to control humanity. And of course, you take one of the fundamental ones like thou shalt not kill. It is impossible not to kill and eat. And so whether you go work on a plant-based existence or an animal-based existence, you still end up killing whatever you eat.
Yes.
Now, of course, the Hebrews will say, well, no, he was referring to murder. And even that becomes complex, because if you start to look at murder properly, what gives a war machine the right to murder with impunity?
Right.
It has no right, according to Moses, if that's the term. And so then the Hebrews try and twist it even more down to a very precise meaning. So everything else is okay except for this type of murder. And of course, it makes a mockery of the idea, because the Ten Commandments weren't meant to cover all spiritual aspects of life. They were the root. And then obviously they could be broken into laws, many, many, many spiritual laws over time. But the fundamentals were the Ten Commandments. And the only one that was true was thou shalt love your true God. That was the only one that was true. All the others were false.
Wow. I mean, that there's a lot of people with a lot of guilt.
Right.
A lot of things.
Right. And
so you imagine it's definitely intentionally done that way so that we make ourselves suffer.
Right.
That would make us easy to control.
And we have obviously an attack on sexual free expression. And so if we go down to the path and we look at the Bible and we look at one character who's become known as Saint Paul, and there are more of St. Paul's writings in the New Testament than the writings of Jesus. So we can see that St. Paul, who was a Pharisee, was there to contaminate the message of Jesus. That
Mm.
was his purpose. And one of the big things that St. Paul said was sex essentially was the root of all evil. And the only reason it could be permitted in human was the necessity for reproduction, because we can't reproduce without sex.
Yeah.
Now, there is actually logic behind this sentiment that has never been explained by any Pharisee or any establishment member.
What is it?
And I'm going to tell you the logic, and it stems right back to Atlantis. But before I do that, I can explain that our intellectual center, in part, which is the cerebral cortex, the magnificent cerebral cortex, and every single human has one, and that is the best evidence to suggest we are an extraterrestrial species. We do not belong on the earth. We are alien, because we are the only creature, the only organism on the earth with a cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is part of an extraterrestrial's, actually a spiritual entity's brain.
Mm.
We've only taken part of it. And though that entity is known as the Syrian, we discussed them before in previous shows, the Syrians. And
Yes.
and they're called Syrians not because they came from Syria, it's because they came from the Sirius star system, from Sirius. And their home planet, is known as Sirius.
Interesting.
And ironically, the myths about Osiris, the god Osiris is a gateway to Cyrus,
Mm.
a spiritual gateway. So the Syrians came from the Sirius region, star system rather, and they set up ancient Atlantis. And this happened on Earth about 30,000 years ago. 35, actually, it was 35,000 years ago. And it's no irony that the fossil remains, the vast majority of fossil remains of humans, started to appear 35,000 years ago.
Mm.
Because there were very, very few humans on the planet prior to that. Because we were taken off by the Syrians and moved to Mars. So we then came with them and we were part of that Atlantis civilization. Under the Atlantis model, the governance of humanity was grassroots. So it was bottom up.
That would be amazing here.
Yeah, so essentially it's that signified in symbology by an equilateral triangle upside down, which means the majority lead. Now we've got majority rule, which is a twist of that philosophy. It's a corruption of it, because in
Yeah.
fact the majority do what they like. They're just voted in, and you have no authority over what they do. And that's why if you look at all their pledges, half the time they don't actually even bother with them. So they get in using lies and deception.
Yeah.
There was also a spiritual authority, which is represented by an upright equilateral triangle in symbology. And the Syrians presided over that. So far, so good. So we know all humans, every single one of us is part Syrian, and we see that legacy in the cerebral cortex, that genetic legacy. So let's go back to Paul and forbidding sex. Do you know, I wonder if any of viewers know, what the origin of the human sex organs are? Were they just ours, or were they based on something?
I have always imagined or had a feeling that they were based on something.
All right, well, this would be correct. Do you know what that something is?
Yeah, I mean, do I describe it accurately? No.
All right, so let me explain. And you can find this actually in Genesis, and it's represented by the serpent. We were created, the human creators were a bipedal, upright bipedal reptilian entity type. Reptilians are a little bit misleading because they are called reptilians because they are of reptilian appearance. They are not reptilian in character. And so the surface reptiles today are not representative of their character. Their character is best represented actually by the cat, feline. Their sexual organs are identical to humans. So they do have sexual capability and they have sexual organs. So they have capability to physically reproduce. So the male of the reptilian species is much more well endowed than your average human. But in
Okay.
terms of the functionality yes, of the equipment, the male equipment, pretty much the same. The female, ironically, has a much smaller, a much more compact version of the human sexual equivalent. So the male is much larger and the female is much smaller. But other than that, we, in sexual terms, are representative of the serpent. And the serpent doesn't get a very good press in Genesis.
No.
It's regarded as and described as the corrupter. And the example is the apple given to, which represents the gene path. So the serpent, the Bible says, or the Genesis says, corrupted the human gene path. And that corruption, ironically, was knowledge. And our knowledge is, in fact, the cerebral cortex, which represents, so the Syrian was corrupted by the serpent. I'll explain this very shortly, what's meant by that. So I was talking about the Syrians became the spiritual authority. And the Pharisees actually wanted to fabricate that spiritual authority without the Syrians. So let's look at how the Syrians reproduce, because I think we might find some key to the problem here.
All right.
So if I go and I'm presuming you don't know how Syrians reproduce.
Nope.
Okay. So let's just evaluate their sexual organs. And when we do that, we find they're missing. They have no sexual organs. Neither male or female possesses sexual organs.
How is that
As
even?
far as I can ascertain, well, I'll carry on. There is a book written by a New Zealand lady called Susie Hansen. And it's called something like Dual Souls Connection or Dual Soul Connection. And she describes an exercise by grey beings. She was taken on a spaceship and in altered state, shall we say, not by drugs, just simply by the fact she shifted closer to a subconscious state rather than being conscious, more into dream state to actually travel with them. She was on the spaceship with these grey beings, which are much fairly small, and they look very similar to the pop culture imagery around the classic bug eyes and very small very small small beings yes, that very slight in appearance. So she went on the ship, and she actually, with children, entered into an exercise. There were many in the room, and they did the same exercise where they take their brainwaves, which they can actually see. They can see the colours, the light that the brainwaves create, and they have this game where they integrate each other's brainwaves. They play puzzle games with them. And when she described her feeling, the experience feeling, she said it was like the best classical music you'd ever heard. And she said it was almost like, and she didn't tell the readers what she wanted to say because she was too embarrassed. What she wanted to say, it was almost like sex. So the Syrians, in the way they reproduce, they don't have sexual organs, but they have extraordinary capabilities with their mind. So they make a choice to do, well, I'll quote Dr. Spock from Star Trek, to do a mind meld.
Wow.
And from that mind meld, they can generate what I suppose will be called an immaculate conception. So
Wow.
they essentially create from energy a new being, which initially is invisible because it's energetic, but then at a certain point in the process attains form. As far as I can ascertain, there is no infancy cycle. So they are born fully mature, and they wouldn't have a belly button as well, which was an acknowledgement of valiant Thor, who was a Venusian visitor, so from the planet Venus, a Venusian visitor, allegedly to the White House, where he was kept under house arrest for 3 years while Eisenhower was president.
Yeah, I've heard about that one. It's extremely interesting.
So going back to why St. Paul said that reproduction, a mundane reproduction, was evil in a sex, so sex was evil, was because the corrupting agent, the reptilian, were capable of lust and needed lust to create sexual relationships, which then would flourish into reproductive capacity.
Yeah, that's kind of how I view things, actually.
And then, but the Syrian doesn't. The Syrian just simply makes a choice, and then moves to it's a symbiosis of togetherness that inspire the new being, the child. And quintessentially, the myths behind the immaculate conception of Jesus confirm this. That Mary didn't have sex with God in the traditional sense, but they still created a child. And because she was an earth, a physical being, it couldn't be a true immaculate conception. She still had to go through the birthing process.
Yeah.
And Jesus went through the stages of life according to the myth. Now, this is probably not true. In fact, it's certainly not true, but it's a good metaphor to underscore the philosophy behind attitudes towards sex and what is spiritually perfect.
Hmm. So it's really just two competing schools of thought.
Right. It is Syrian versus reptilian, which ironically means it's Syrian versus Anunnaki, because along the Anunnaki line, which the Syrians broke free of, the lowest point was the reptilian prior to us.
Hmm.
So that's your background, or our background.
Yeah, I didn't really know all of that. Some of it I had ideas about, but explains a lot to me.
Yes. And obviously, when we talk about the different races of human and acknowledgement of them, the different races were not arbitrary, if that makes sense. They were purposeful.
Yeah.
And the reason they were purposeful is that some would have represented the Syrian, and the Syrian may have different brackets within their hierarchies, and all those, there would have been an attempt to represent all those different brackets because human is Syrian. We are the next step, so to speak. But there are a whole host of other entity types. In fact, Alex Collier, on his review of the Genome Project, identified at least 26 extraterrestrial types in the Genome Project's findings. So that's a lot of extraterrestrial types that need to be divided to allow their expression in humanity. So we've been taught under the atheist model that that's all a load of old nonsense. That the reality is we just sort of everything popped into being, and then things evolved with no particular purpose other than by some miracle evolution does go in a positive direction.
Yeah, I've always had a hard time with that wives' tale.
Right. And, even though there are atheist dissenters such as Teilhard de Chardin, who recognize that the stages of evolution are so marked and so noticeable, there has to be a planner. And if there's there had to be a plan. There had to be a plan. And if there's a plan, there has to be a planner. And the planner is God.
And that just goes right out of the like just blows everything else out of the water
And
because
that
to
and
find
that and that's why and that and that's why Teilhard de Chardin's Peking Man had to be discredited and debunked and exposed as a fraud because he had defied atheism by that statement, so he was ridiculed at the end of his life. Does that make sense?
yes.
So I can't remember where we got to, but have you got any questions in guiding the viewers?
Oh, well, we're coming up on a break right now.
Oh, okay. Sounds
All
good.
right,
Good
so
point
we
to
will
break.
be right back.
Is there a break?
Yeah, we're gonna get back to your host.
All right, we are back. Are you there?
I am eagerly waiting.
All right. Well. Yes, I feel very actually pretty happy after learning what you have just spoken of.
Great. I'm hoping it's put things in perspective.
Really has, actually.
So, do you have any? We covered quite a lot of ground in that short segment, and I think you can see why I was very reluctant to deal with the actual races themselves without that background. Are there any questions that you spring to mind that might anticipate the listeners' confusion over anything?
I mean, I think I'm less confused, but um, I don't really have any particular questions myself.
Okay.
I
All
would
right.
like. I mean, we were talking about before we actually started recording. We were talking about the mitochondria. I can't.
Mitochondrial
Yeah,
DNA versus nucleic. Yes. So I think that's a good path to go down. But first, I'd like to just continue a little bit on the give a better idea of these. So about the different entity types. I mentioned about Alex Collier, who calls himself an Andromedan ambassador, who scrutinized the work of the Genome Project, and it was his opinion that the Genome Project had identified at least 26 different extraterrestrial DNA assets in our genome. And I was explaining the reason for that. So we had covered the Syrian, which I think is emphasized by the Caucasian races of man. And according to the Hebrews, there are 13 Caucasian races. And I've no reason to doubt that. But there are also a whole host of other races. We've got the Asian, and I'm talking about Chinese, and this is very important, Asian. So we have the Chinese Asian races. We have the Aboriginal Asian races, and we have the ethnic Negro. And that's about it. And so the Aboriginal races were represented different types of Lemurian. The Lemurians were an ancient governor of Earth. So they were one of the ancient king lines. They lived for a very long time compared to humans. So they lived for thousands of years. And they are represented in forgot the full name of the King's List, the Babylonian King's List. I can't remember is it the Epic of Gilgamesh or something like that? So those kings, which stretch back hundreds of thousands of years, they were some of them were Lemurians. Sorry, not Lemurians, Lemurians. And Lemuria, the Lemurian center was Lemuria, and they governed over the continent of Mu, the mythical continent of Mu, Mu. So their character facets and their various types are represented by the human Aboriginal Asian types. The non-Aboriginal Asian types were moving into the Chinese territory. We're moving into the Japanese territory. And particularly Japanese are evidence of Lemurian.
Oh.
And the Lemurians now live in colonies just below the surface of Mars, 1 or 2 miles below the surface of Mars. They live in caverns. And they are still physical because they occasionally visit Earth in solid craft. So a lot of the UFOs are not solid. They're actually outside our dimensional reference, but because their bandwidth is so big, they can be seen, but they can't be touched physically.
Interesting.
They can be accessed in sub or superconscious state, where all the rules behind reality change. And that's why people go down the path of taking substances to try and get into altered state to approximate these changes in reality?
I would say it's a little bit more than approximation. It really puts you in it. Like
Yes,
person who has lived through that, like reality
yes.
tends to turn into a plasticky type
But
feel.
I said, but the attempt is to approximate. I didn't say that when you get there, it is an approximation. But
Okay.
in terms of in terms of the desire or the ambition is an approximation.
Yes. Because it doesn't always actually happen. You know what I mean? You don't
Right,
get that far.
right, right. So, where were we? We're talking about other entities. Yeah, so I was talking about the Lumerians
And
visit
the
Earth in physical ships that are made of metal, very occasionally. And I believe I've actually seen a physical entity here, so they can actually come and they can mingle with humans because they look just they're a bit odd looking, but they're the same sort of rough shape and size, so they could theoretically fit in with as humans. Just very odd looking.
I have personally witnessed very purplish entity or either a projection or a real physical being or somewhat physical, like walking around my area.
Right.
And that was recently. And it had it like a tail and like purplish skin. Very intriguing. And I caught this glimpse of it and I absolutely knew that it was real. Which is
So
like,
what in
was
terms of
that?
in terms of that being, what animal did it remind you of? In terms of
I'm
its
I'm near 100% certain it was like more of a reptilian.
yeah, but in terms of
It's, well,
did
it
it
had a
remind you
tail.
of a because the reptilian, you see, the reptilian actually just denotes the skin type. Rather than rather than pinpointing the species type or the race within that species bracket. So that's why if you look at the appearance of any reptilian visitor, it becomes quite important to determine which bracket of reptilian they are.
It's not fur for sure, but it's very hard. It's almost like skin.
Right. Okay.
I
Interesting. In terms of its back, was it very humanoid in stance, or was it more of an animal?
No, more humanoid,
All right. All
like
right.
standing upright.
Yeah. So it probably, by the sounds of things, is just a variation of its Chidahuria, normally green, or often come green, but they come in all kinds of colours. So it'll be one or other of their variants.
Mm.
So I
I
was
mean,
going back.
tail. That was, intriguing.
Yes, a lot of them do have
Okay.
tails. So some don't. Some reptilians have no tail, others do, and it's a long tail as well. I was interested in light of our discussions about the so-called rat people. The rat people are so they've got a reptilian, but they've got a rodent style. They've got a tail, long tail, but they've got a sort of arched back, which gives them a bit of a sort of rotund appearance, can I say? Makes them look a bit portly almost, but they're not.
Hmm.
They move very fast as well.
And
So I was just trying to work out whether you had a visit from one of those. So going back to the how we did determine the different brackets, the mark brackets of the human races. If we look at and we're talking about the Chinese agents, they stem from the Lemurian. Sorry, not Lemurian, Lumerian, who are on, or rather beneath the surface, who live now beneath the surface of Mars. But occasionally I've seen them in physical terms, very occasionally. Now the Chinese, in particular, I believe that at least one of their brackets was, and so I've skipped. I believe that the Japanese are probably the purest or best approximation of that Lemurian heritage. And there are certain Chinese races that are much more reptilian in characteristic. So the two most reptilian races within the human genome bracket are Asian and Negro.
okay.
So that pretty much wraps up the big picture human genome. So you were asking about mitochondrial versus nucleic DNA,
Yes.
which we discussed before, and it was a great segment. It was a shame we didn't actually record that. So I'm hoping my memory works.
I know. By the time you got to the end of that part, I was just like, "Oh crap! We really should have been recording that part." But I didn't get a chance to.
I did feel it blew you away. I did feel it blew you
Well,
away.
to be brutally honest, all that extra information surrounding like sex that really blew me away more than anything else. But I want to keep going because we already covered that.
Yes, yes. And so, we got on to the discussion of the two DNA paths, two marked DNA paths within humanity, because we were discussing about origins and how the Genome Project reflects that. And I said that the Genome Project essentially looks at symptoms which are found in chemical compounds represented by strings of amino acids in the body.
Hmm.
And they log irregularities in those strings, many, many irregularities, and they speculate as to what they mean. And some of that speculation has allowed them to date the origin of the program, the DNA program of humanity. And so the date they have for the mitochondrial DNA, which is found in the human female, which is carried by the female, is somewhere between 150 and 300,000 years old.
All right.
Now, in practicality, this is representative, and it was carried, according to the Genome Project, by 8 females. They haven't been able to get to 1, which tells us that there was a batch that was created. So the initial human females were not conceived. They were created. And there were 8 of them.
Interesting.
They were given license, obviously, because they produced sexual organs. They had sexual organs, but they were not conceived. They were created. The deliverer of that DNA was ape. So the mitochondrial DNA in human represents the ape. And the ape, we can speculate, I can't say for sure, that was used is Neanderthal. I do theorize that the reason, even with all the compelling evidence supporting Sasquatch's existence today, the reason it has never been formally discovered and acknowledged by science is because they found a live one. They would be able to discern the link with human.
Yeah.
And it would destroy religion as it's known today. Even so, Adam represents Neanderthal in the Bible,
Oh,
in biblical
really?
Genesis, yes. So Eve was not Adam's wife. Eve was created from Adam's DNA. And Eve was human. And the reason that Eve is described as a female and Adam a male is all humans are feminine compared to the Neanderthal,
Yes.
whether male or female.
I've had
And
two personal.
all Neanderthals are masculine compared to the human, whether male or female.
I've had 2 personal encounters with Sasquatch, and I will say that they are very scary.
Yes.
Like in terms of body size and being very masculine. Yeah, I'd say that.
Yes. This is correct. The nucleic line of DNA, according to the Genome Project, or rather, according who is interpreting data submitted by the Genome Project, could stretch back billions of years. It stretches back so far, nobody has really been able to acknowledge when it began, when that legacy began.
Hmm. So all humans then have the more feminine mitochondrial DNA, right?
They do, but they also have nucleic DNA. So it's a partnership. And in the nucleic DNA, you find representation of all the other entity types.
Hmm.
Notably, I mentioned grey beings earlier, and because we haven't reached a point where we can create life, we can clone it theoretically, although we're very cumbersome in the way that we do that. We can clone it theoretically, but we can't create life. And the reason we can't create life is we don't understand how to do it.
Yeah.
That's one reason. And the second reason is we can't see how to create life because you have to go beyond the amino acids. The amino acids are simply a symptom. You have to
Yeah.
go beyond, and you have to go a long way beyond the amino acids to see the tools, the tool chest that's used to build, create life.
Interesting.
And so when you understand what's required, the the picture looks very different. So I mentioned grey beings earlier, and these are often referred to, although there are many, many different types of grey beings, these are often referred to as zetas, because this was an entity that a long time ago originated from the Zeta Reticuli star system until it was overrun, actually, ironically, by a reptilian party of marauders. And so the Zetas decided to uproot rather than coexist. The Zeta element of our, the Zeta element in terms of our DNA is present for a very good reason. And anyone with true knowledge of how to create would know that reason. And the reason is this, that where you have a complex catalogue, you need some glue or putty to hold everything together. And so the Zeta DNA, which is the most flexible of all DNA in the universe, is used as the glue that keeps the human genome together.
Interesting.
And so every human is Zeta. We know every human is reptilian because we have shared sex organs.
Yeah.
We know every human is Syrian because we have this part of the Syrian brain system. In fact, we know every human is reptilian. We have additional information that every human is reptilian because the Syrian brain system bolts on to the limbic system, which is the reptilian brain.
Yes.
So our libido is shared real estate between Syrian and reptilian.
Interesting.
So there's essentially a power struggle, which is expressed between conflict between compassion, interest of compassion, and interest of conscience or intellect.
Mm.
And I've had a very bitter breakup in a relationship recently. And that has been played out through the conflict of interest between compassion and intellect. And that's what it's boiled down to. That's how the relationship withered and collapsed.
Yeah.
Whether it can be resurrected is up to God. So that explains the structure and purpose of human DNA.
We will actually be coming up on a break here in a second too.
Oh, okay, so we can
because we got a couple more seconds. See, that's
so
very interesting, and it makes perfect sense because of the way that the human brain operates, and we're even told this in school about the reptilian brain versus the mammalian brain. Oh, okay. And we're back, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay.
Studio.
Well, we covered a lot of ground last segment.
We did.
So do you have any burning questions on the viewer's behalf to continue the momentum, so to speak?
Well,
or listeners' behalf, rather.
Are there any other, okay, so we haven't really discussed the human body energy system, which can consist of, anywhere from 3 to 7 or 12 chakras, I guess.
Yes.
So what happens, isn't that part of the spiritual makeup of a human being, and does that have to do with different entities, or they all have sort of the same makeup?
Well, this is the conflict that was represented and why God became angry according to Genesis. And this was the conflict that human was both an animal and a spiritual being. And ironically, that conflict is another reason for the breakup of my last relationship, the conflict between animal and a spiritual being. And so the chakra points and the energy systems that govern over our bodies are actually evidence of our spiritual legacy. And there we move into the spiritual genetic hierarchies, which I've explained in prior shows. But ultimately, the very pinnacle of that hierarchy is a group called the Anunnaki.
Yes.
Below them is, I'll explain again, it's always worth going through it one more time. You can never say this too much because of ignorance. Obviously, it's just it's not known amongst humans. This information is not known. So the Anunnaki are what we call non-manifest beings.
Yes.
So they essentially, they can will identity types for themselves. So they can see each other as physical beings. Should they wish to.
Interesting.
But it's an effort to do that.
Mm.
They are invisible. They are non-physical. Sorry, non-manifest. And essentially, according to legend, the Anunnaki influence weather systems. So they hide in weather systems in physical existence. They then produced manifest beings, which go under the group name of Baal.
Yes.
And Baal simply means either praise or bless God. Al, by the way, is just a variation of all, because in effect, God is everything. There's nothing you can take away. It's the collective, the collective all. So bless God is Baal. And Baal, though manifest, was not physical. So Baal created physical beings, which, according to the Greek group name, are known as Drakon. But our name for these is dragon or dragons. And these were physical beings that have been very much misrepresented through interpretation of mythology or misinterpretation of mythology. And the dragon were the initial G masters. They created the dinosaurs, all of them. And we mentioned in the previous show that their original man was Tyrannosaurus Rex. That was their best man as far as they were concerned. They hadn't produced one better than them, and that's why Tyrannosaurus Rex genetics was sewn into Siacar, and they're sewn into us as well, because we're part. Sorry, I said Siacar. We're sewn into the Cephidim Chitauri, and they're sewn into us as well, because we are the legacy of the Cephidim Chitauri, which is seen in our limbic system, reptilian brain, and our reptilian sexual organs.
Interesting.
So the dragons then created a mammalian man, which was ape, part ape, was more closest to the bat, if the truth be known, because it used pteroid. It was anchored around pteroid DNA, and that was the next man. And then after that came Chitauri, which was Sephidim, or the Sephidim, and these were created from, amongst other components, Tyrannosaurus Rex. Actually, the Chitauri also have Syrian, but they do not have the cerebral cortex. So there is Syrian used in the genome, the Chitauri genome.
Okay.
And the Chitauri themselves then created a version of themselves in their own image, even though that image represented Syrian, and that being was man, as we know as human.
Interesting.
So when we look at the spiritual legacy of man, and the reason we have chakras and meridians, and we have a kundalini, or we allegedly have a kundalini, according to our sciences. You know, some will agree to the claim, others don't. Is it in fact that at the fundamental level, this represents the dragon template, which was the highest spiritual template, physical template of the Anunnaki. And the only way you could get higher was to move out of physicality into metaphysical realms, which are presided over by Baal. And ironically, that is why the reptilian higher entities who are now outside our dimensional reference point use our chakras as teleportation devices, as a sort of teleportation communication link. So they'll travel through a human body, travel through the crown chakra usually, and come out through the throat.
You know, I've actually had that happen to me.
It's a very, very disconcerting experience.
I was certainly confused. Well, actually, I wasn't. I mean, I saw it happen.
Because obviously a reptilian's quite large.
It was very intriguing.
Yes. And so we also ourselves witnessed, in some of the work we've done privately, occupation of the chakra points. So reptilians can have the ability of hiding in a chakra.
Yes.
Which is a move off topic, a move on tangent, because we were discussing the the relationship between the energy field and what essentially is the physical genome, the human genome.
Yes.
And I'm really more compelled to say that the relationship is actually accidental. That it's actually two paths which may travel along side by side without interruption, but also may come up against inevitable conflicts of interest. But I personally believe that those conflicts of interest are there for a reason, to be overcome.
Okay.
Not to be squandered or forsaken.
I would agree.
So when there is a conflict between intellect and compassion, it's there for the learning experience and the resolve of that conflict.
Okay.
And so to deny God, you refuse to resolve. You refuse to make the sacrifice. Or you're unable to make the sacrifice. So that's a bit of poignant thinking. So that answers that. That answers the chakra points. They don't have any, because everybody has the same network. They don't relate to race divisions within humanity. Because all humans have chakra points. All humans have meridian. We're all based on this spiritual template, which derives from the dragon energy field.
Yes.
Which is the representation of Anunnaki in physical space. Well, one of the ironies, of course, is I mentioned there's about an ascension, which is mythology actually provided by Judaism, of all things. Jesus talked about the ascension, but nobody understood what was meant by it. And so it didn't happen. In fact, Jesus, if you reference the Gospel of Thomas, which is in the pseudepigrapal texts, is recorded to have said that circumcision, from the intellectual perspective, is actually isn't a paradox. It denies God. No logic can define circumcision, because if God wanted human to be circumcised, he would have been born that way.
Yep, I have. I mean, I'm still scarred from that, obviously.
And the philosophy or ideology behind circumcision is a spiritual one. It is very possible to be spiritually circumcised, which reflects on the Syrian heritage, which is a removal of that, or it's a sexual statement. It is a statement to say, I'm going to be like Syrian, who has no sexual capability at all.
Yeah, it's not me.
Right. And the thing is, and why it's such a a travesty, and Jesus didn't say this, but why it's such a travesty is your circumcision wasn't your choice. It was made for you. And you are the person who's got to run through the legacy. And
Yep.
actually, in my recent breakup, my choice was ignored. I was only left with a legacy. So it's very similar in that respect. And that's really the flaw of humanity. That we, the great flaw of humanity, that we try and oppress. And your circumcision, however well-meaning it may have been, was your oppression.
I've always felt that way.
The wearing of masks, the muzzling of humanity, however well-meaning it might be, is humanity's oppression.
Yeah, I kind of refuse to wear those most of the time.
Yeah, so do I. And we have a situation here where Sydney's had an outbreak that intellectually is nonsense, but we've had an outbreak, and now the transport network has made the wearing of masks mandatory. And so 90% of people that travel on trains wear masks. 10% buck the system. And ironically, I heard a policeman interviewed many years ago, probably more than 30 years ago, on the Oprah Winfrey show. And I don't watch TV anymore. I haven't watched TV for years, but I used to watch TV then. And he said, we know that 5% of society will always buck the system. And 5% of humanity will always champion the system, no matter how bad or good it is.
Yeah.
And 90% will follow.
Yeah, I'm not one of those followers.
So those are the statistics, and that's been shown by, I've said 10%, but it's probably 5% of people that travel trains will not wear the masks because they won't follow the system. They're the 5% that buck the system. And so if the authorities want to ratchet it up, they will simply go attack that 5%. At the moment in Sydney, nothing has happened. There's been no attack strategy. But it may happen in the future. So we've covered an enormous amount of ground. Is there any other question you have on behalf of the listeners?
Whoa. I mean, I'm not sure where to take this to next.
Well, we still got quite a bit of time on this segment, or are we?
Yes.
All right.
I'll double
So
check fast, but no, we got about 10 minutes left or something.
All right, let's do an introduction to the final segment. So I think what we can do is, actually, why don't we started it last time. We'll finish off just with the races. So I've gone and talked obviously about the African, the Negro, the Asian, the two types of Asian, the Chinese, the and Asian and the Aborigine Asian, and the Caucasian genetic paths, of which the Arabs are probably Caucasian, by the way.
Okay.
And the Arab may be the 13th tribe, the one that was denied by the Jews. So they only acknowledged 12 tribes. And the one that was denied was the Arab.
Well, that would explain a lot of the problems between the two.
Right, right. we discussed last time, I'm not very good on the races. So I know that obviously the tribe of Dan were the blue-eyed blonde that ended up, the core created Denmark, or which is known actually as Danmark, or the I think that means the land of Dan. So that was to the tribe of Dan after in one of the exoduses settled in Denmark, and obviously they spread to and created all the Scandinavian peoples, which are blonde-haired, blue-eyed, which I think is actually was the basis for Hitler's mythical Aryan type.
Yeah.
He was talking about the pure tribe of Dan, and that's why the tribe of Dan, or Danes, are actually given special privileges today in the world from the globalist perspective. The tribe of Benjamin was bad. They were bad because they were spiritual beings, and at that time of writing, and there's this great conflict by when the Old Testament was written, some of the writers championed the reptilian Sephardim and the will, the spiritual will of the reptilian Sephardim. Other writers champion the spiritual will of the Syrian leaders of Atlantis.
Mm.
So the reason that the tribe of Ben was discredited by by Jewish folklore is that they had intuitive powers and natural genius, which emphasized Syrian qualities, and that conflicted with the preservation of the reptilian agenda in man, the reptilian containment of man. And so the red-haired, green-eyed represent the tribe of Ben, and they had an early exodus to the promised land, which is Ireland.
Huh.
And that's where they settled. Later, I don't know which race, but another of the races exodused from the Israel region, or from Judea, rather. There was an exodus from Judea. The Jews didn't settle in Israel; settled in Judea. There was an exodus from Judea, and they were black-haired, brown-eyed, and they joined their brothers and sisters in Ireland, and that happened about 500 BC. So presumably anywhere up to 500 or more years after the initial exodus. So there are some other things to say. So that's all I really know about the human Caucasian genome in terms of the different races. Or all I've been granted, the only information I've been granted up to this point. But I can talk about the other aspects of the genome. So if we move to the Negroes, who's originally known as Olmecs, and these are discussed, or these appear in Mayan folklore. And the Olmecs, which were saved, were rescued from another planet, and they were taken to Earth and given sanctuary on Earth.
Oh, we're coming up on a break.
Okay.
Talk to you in a few.
Okay.
And we're back once again.
Right.
So we're talking about some of the different races on Earth.
Correct. And I think I started talking about the Olmecs,
Yes.
which are a Negro extraterrestrial humanoid race that were rescued from another planet.
Which is extremely interesting.
And as far as I don't know if they actually exist in pure form today, but as far as I can ascertain, they were based on the human template. So they were human. with the cerebral cortex, with the limbic system brain. There might have been greater adaptation. There may have been some very acute genetic differences. But I believe that they've all gone. They've been lost over time, over many thousands of years. They've interbred, and they've watered down that genetic legacy, that genetic heritage. And so the heritage is just become so weak, it's unrecognizable in the modern day genome. And so the Olmecs originally settled in Africa, and I've written quite extensively about this because in one of my past lives, I was an African warrior and I saved the people.
Huh.
Do you recall that on my website where I talk about I'm Yoshana?
Yes, I was actually thinking about that earlier today.
Reincarnated. And I remember the time well. And this was about, say, 19,000 years ago, 18,000 years ago, something like that. So a long time ago. And at that time, Africa was a continental island, which approximated about 50% of today's Africa, but just the southern region. So it was surrounded by water. And because of the politics governing Earth up until 24,000 years ago, there had been no attempt from the inner dwelling reptilians, and it would take me the entire planet to explain that story, why there are reptilians inside our Earth. So the viewers will listeners will just have to take that for granted. We can do that in another show. But so it took a long time for the inner dwelling reptilians to come out and explore the surface. And when they did, they visited Africa. I'm not sure whether it was just incidental or there was a specific purpose in targeting the Africans. That's unknown to me. But what I do know is that through the witch doctors, and that the witch doctors have been around for a very long time. And the way witch doctors operate is almost the reverse of shaman. So it's a reversal of the shamanic practice. And so through the witch doctors, the witch doctor could channel Chitahuri. And initially, the Chitahuri showed them their powers, their extraordinary powers, and they gave them some great abilities by basically, a bit like you've said, it's by merging. But then later they abused those powers, and they got the Africans to do crazy things so they could feed off the energy that they produced. And this is in part represented by the Kali Ma tales, which don't refer to India, they refer certainly initially to Africa. Those, basically, well, they were blood orgies, essentially.
Whoa.
So, yes. So I went and saved them, and I thwarted the reptilians. I removed their presence, or helped the Africans remove their presence. And then Syrians came. I'm presuming the Syrians came because of the work I'd done. And they moved the Olmec to a safer region, free of that would be free at that time, although later it wasn't free, of reptilian interference, and they moved them to South America, Latin America. And so that's why you see Olmec effigies, if I can call that, or stone carvings, represented in the Mayan history, which the history is recorded in stone carvings. And so the Olmecs moved from Africa, were moved by the Syrians, who are remembered by the Mayans as the Viracocha. So the Viracocha moved the Olmec Negro to Africa. Sorry, to I've got ahead of myself, to Latin America. And over many, many years, actually, it may not have been that. So we can speculate that either the gene pool, the group gene pool, just simply assimilated characteristics of Olmec across the reproductive path, or it didn't. And legacy of the Great Flood, which was 13,500, actually I lied, 12,500 years ago. The Great Flood that theoretically could have wiped out humanity. And if that was so, celestial forces that restocked Earth about 10,000 years ago.
And that would be the myth that, humanity is only 10,000 years old or less.
Right. The entities that restocked Earth 10,000 years ago didn't include the Olmec genome. And that is the reason it hasn't, because they weren't human. So they weren't included. They were a different bracket. They weren't close enough to our bracket because they were an extraterrestrial.
Interesting.
So the two theories might stand. I'm not sure which one is correct. So I don't know if they've been genetically wiped out through reproduction or whether they were never included on the restock if that happened. Some argue that the Japanese race were sponsored by extraterrestrials.
I've definitely heard that they're a refugee race, and
Yes.
I have spent a life there, so.
And so if they are a Lemurian refugee race. So they are the closest human being to the Lemurian legacy.
Interesting.
However, the Lemurians are nothing like human in many regards in character. They would be seen as insane if they were allowed to formally integrate with society.
Why exactly? Is that why 78% of all the weird stuff in the world comes out of Japan?
Perhaps. Because there are some insane things the Japanese do.
I won't argue with that. Japan is a very interesting, weird place.
So Japan is just a taste. The Lemurians integrated with Earth, you'd see what insanity was. From our perspective, it isn't insane. That's the way they are. Their libido is different to us. We have to respect that. We can't judge them. And they can't judge us either. So let's move to the more big picture, because it's essential to do that to finish this off, to get the viewer to really understand what's going on. And I mentioned before, obviously, I've just touched on the Anunnaki, I've mentioned Baal, I've mentioned dragons, I've mentioned the mammalian. I didn't say who it was, but that was Pteroid. And then I've mentioned Chitauri or Sephidim. Chitauri are Sephidim, which were the reptilian races. And so there is a big picture that hovers over humanity, because with each new spiritual being, and Chitauri is a spiritual being, which is affirmed by biblical Genesis. Genesis tells us the serpent is a spiritual being.
Yes.
Pteroid is a spiritual being, and that's represented by Yahweh. And under Celtic culture, Pteroid is Hu Gadam, which is the Hu god. And as we know, the Celts were the Jews that settled, the breakaway Jews. They were the tribe of Benjamin. So the Celtic culture derived from the tribe, uniquely from the tribe of Benjamin's perception of existence and how existence unraveled. So the tribe of Benjamin knew all about Pteroid. And of course, we know dragons, we discussed those, but they've been misrepresented by folklore because they appear in the Bible. And nobody realizes the dragons are represented by the Bible because the dragons are angels. Spiritual angels, because they fly.
Wow.
And Baal is also represented by the Bible, not just in the negative terms, which was Isaiah's criticism of the worship of idols, notably the sacred calf or the golden calf.
Yeah.
And Isaiah's also a memorable description, which is both positive and negative. It's a frightening description of Baal. But there's also a hidden legacy, because Baal is represented by the archangels. So where an archangel is mentioned, there you have Baal. So Gabriel is a Baal manifest. Michael is a Baal manifest. And then we have the next level up, and that isn't represented by the Bible or any of the texts, even though they sometimes use any of the ancient record, you know, the Vedic text, the Mayan, the Pulva. They don't represent the Anunnaki. When Anunnaki is mentioned, they talk about Baal because they describe the manifest. They have never described the non-manifest, not in specific terms. The non-manifest is hidden. In fact, the closest you get to the description of the non-manifest is in Zoroastrianism.
Mm.
And that's very important. I'll discuss that shortly, because we'll get to the crux. So above the angel hierarchies, which the next step according to the Bible is God. So if anything, then that is the Anunnaki.
Yes.
And so the Anunnaki have a direct, indirect relationship with human. And that is what I think is worth focusing on.
Okay.
And this is where the one race misconception is vilified. So if we move and consider creative purpose in terms of life fulfills spiritual needs, and those spiritual needs are vastly refracted, so they have many different components, many different interests, many different emotional or specific intellectual outputs. And if I can just give you work on the emotions, we have caring, we've got bitterness, we've got joy, we've got hatred, we've got love, we've got lust, and so on and so on. And these are all different expressive values that are generated by emotions. Emotion is the group term.
Mm.
So essentially, the Anunnaki had a lot of expressive interests, have a lot of expressive interests, refracted expressive interests to vent or channel.
Interesting.
So unsurprisingly, they are channeled all the way down the spiritual hierarchical path, all the way down to Chidahuri, and then now all the way down to human. And I give the analogy in my book that Anunnaki relationship is very similar to our mind. It is a relationship with cells of our body.
Mm.
We really don't know what our cell, from the perception of an individual cell in our body, what it appears its best interests are. We only know what the best interests of our mind are, and potentially the feedback our body gives us to what we do to it. And the same can be said for the Anunnaki. So in a sense, we are the atomic cells of this giant group entity energy force, which can eat up an entire solar system or a galaxy if necessary. And we are the response at the very lowest level. And this was recognized by Zoroastrianism and expressed as influential energy pockets in the sky. And so if you lived in a particular region, you could become infected by the energy delivered by the atmosphere. And this is theoretically true because, of course, I explained earlier that the Anunnaki live in weather systems. It's untrue today because the Anunnaki ascended themselves about 35,000 years ago by linear time. and that took them so far adrift of physical dimension bandwidth that they no longer could connect with physicality. Having said that, they can connect with the spiritual energy of man, because that's set, or that's located in much, much higher bandwidth regions. So the Anunnaki still can either connect with or infect our subconscious or superconscious.
Interesting.
And because of the nature of the Anunnaki, the emotional, or their bandwidth in terms of expressive interest, stands from the most negative of our values to the most exalted and positive, depending on which of their many governors over their desire connects with humanity. Depends on how damaging or accelerating that influence will be. And of course, being a prophet, Zoroaster warned of the negative rather than focusing on the positive.
Huh. I never really paid much attention to Zoroastrianism so far.
And so, if we move on the next level up to Baal, we've got a different series of influences. Baal essentially becomes a connection point, or becomes, sorry, Baal, the dragons offer a connection point between all entities below them and Baal.
Interesting.
So through using the dragons as a filter, the physical domains will also have interference from Baal interests. And rightly so, in a sense, because we are demonstrative legacy. Without them, we wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
And so they also channel their specific interests all the way down the spectrum. And then the dragons themselves have specific interests which are channeled all the way down the spectrum. And then we move down to Pteroid, which is Pan in folklore. So our connection with nature is demonstrative of Pteroid influence. Where we don't have a connection with nature, we've lost that connection with Pteroid.
I have an intense connection to nature myself.
And we then move down to the reptilian. And I've been talking about negative reptilian qualities. There's a lot of positive, enormous legacy of positive reptilian qualities. One of those is the interest in celestial connection or connection with God.
Oh, we are running out of time. We're all done with the show.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Steve. You have a wonderful evening.
Well, that was a good point to finish.
Yes, it was. We will continue with this perhaps next show.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's go and do very quickly. I'll come back to you on Skype on your normal channel, and see if I can just do this video recording test